Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jake Herzog. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Music, and I serve as associate coordinator for the Arkansas Center for Black Music and this wonderful event, the Black Music Symposium. And thank you very much for being here. Welcome to the research component of our symposium. So we'll hear some wonderful presentations today. And then we'd like to invite you to an open clinic this evening at 6 p.m. at the Epley Band Hall with our wonderful guest artist, Elio Villafranca, a pianist from Cuba, one of the top pianists in the world. And he will be here all day tomorrow on this stage, beginning at 11:50 with a presentation on Afro-Caribbean music, and then again at 2 p.m. for a piano workshop, and at 7:30 p.m. for a featured concert. Saturday, we'd love to invite you all to the Union right over here, the Arkansas Union, where beginning at noon, we will have Afro-Caribbean food and music in the Union Theater and the art gallery on the 4th floor. So if you have nothing to do, then please come by. If you have something to do, then cancel it and come by anyway. It's going to be absolutely fabulous. So it is a true pleasure today to introduce our first speaker. Please welcome Dr. Violeta Lorenzo from the University of Arkansas Department of World Languages for this first wonderful presentation.
Thank you to the symposium organizers. I know there's a lot of work that goes into planning events like this, so kudos to them. And thanks everyone for being here today. So I am not a musicologist. I am a literature professor, particularly Latin American and Caribbean literature professor. And I study, among other things, discourses of national and racial identity in coming-of-age novels. And this is one novel that came out a couple of years ago, 2007, 2009, Palomos. And what struck me about it is that it does talk about national identity and nationalism, but it kind of has a soundtrack to go along with it, and most of it is reggaeton music. The novel is in Spanish, and most of the music that is mentioned is also in Spanish, so I'm going to be translating some quotes. The translation of the quotes are my own. So with this, I start. Not many would have thought that reggaeton, a type of music that started in the late 80s and early 90s in marginal Afro-Caribbean and diasporic communities, would reach international popularity thanks to performers like Don Omar, Daddy Yankee, Ivy Queen, Maluma, Karol G, Tego Calderon, and of course, Bad Bunny. However, reggaeton has not been without controversy due to its foul language, sexual crudeness, and violent references. In fact, in some places, there have been attempts to ban or censor reggaeton because it supposedly attacks morality, good manners, and critical thinking while corrupting young people. For example, in 1995, the Puerto Rican police raided stores like Discomania, La Gran Discoteca, Farmacias González, and others that sold tapes and CDs with underground music that was deemed pornographic in nature and supposedly encouraged the use of drugs. I mean, this was back in the 90s where you had specialized stores where you would go and buy tapes and CDs. Not that common anymore. Fortunately, these acts of state censorship were unsuccessful, but stores were required to put labels cautioning parents about the obscenity of the lyrics. The legal ramifications of the censorship did not deter state officials 7 years later in 2002. For example, politician Belda González attempted to pass legislature in the Puerto Rican Senate prohibiting perreo, the dance associated with reggaeton. Something similar can be said about the situation in the Dominican Republic, whereas Deborah Pacini Hernandez has explained, and I quote, "The then more authoritarian Dominican government subjected young rappers to even greater levels of censorship than in Puerto Rico, hindering Dominican rappers and reggaetoneros in their ability to access the media and develop a mass public fan base," end quote. But these attempts to control music are futile. The popularity of reggaeton and perreo has spread far and wide and cannot be contained. And I just wanted to share this list with you about music that at some point in time has caused a moral panic among some members of society by claiming that this is music that is uncultured, that it just fosters corruption, that it's too vulgar in nature. And this is just a sample: bomba, plena, rumba, guaracha, son, bolero, tango, and reggaeton. It is very interesting that many of these types of music have some Afro-Caribbean root, which begs the question if there is some implicit bias and discrimination by considering cultural production, musical cultural production from the Afro-Caribbean, vulgar in nature. The other interesting thing is that in Spanish, we have the Real Academia de la Lengua Española, or the Royal Academy of the Spanish Language. It's pretty much an organism that pretty much monitors the proper use of language. And every year, they incorporate new words into their dictionary and into the Spanish language. And last year, in 2023, the word perreo was admitted to the dictionary. And it was interesting to see how people were like, well, you know, they're moving along with the times. It's a type of dance. It's pretty popular. And some people were a little bit annoyed by the fact that a word like this would be considered worthy to be incorporated into the Diccionario de la Real Academia Española. So just sharing some cultural background as to the backlash that some types of Black music have faced in different contexts. With this in mind, this presentation will focus on a short analysis on the use of reggaeton in the novel Palomos by award-winning Dominican writer Pedro Antonio Valdez. This novel is an example of how Caribbean and Latin American literary production has begun to incorporate reggaeton in a similar way to how it did in past decades with bolero and salsa and other musical genres. In other words, the novel shows how other art forms like literature, which tend to be considered highbrow, have continued to focus on music, thematically and in some cases structurally, even music that has been considered uncultured. And here I have a couple of examples of novels, important novels in the Latin American and Caribbean canon that somehow reference music. The first two by Luis Rafael Sánchez, La importancia de llamarse Daniel Santos and La guaracha del Macho Camacho, focus on salsa and the guaracha. The other book is a poetry book by Cuban poet Nicolás Guillén called Motivos del Son. And structurally, the poems are very rhythmic, and they try to mimic what a son would sound like. Other examples would be Son de Almendra, the novel Que Viva la Música, which incorporates salsa and rock and roll. La Amante de Gardel focuses on tango, and Bachata del Aire Caído by Pedro Antonio Valdez focus on bachata music. And then Bolero. A lot of novels have been published that focus on Bolero. La Última Noche que Pasé Contigo, Arráncame la Vida, Contigo a la Distancia, etc. Actually, preparing for this talk, I realized that there is enough material for me to prepare a special topics course on music and Latin American literature. It's very exciting. The novel Palomos subverts the classic paradigm of the coming-of-age novel, or Bildungsroman, with a soundtrack that illustrates the contradictions of the young protagonist's coming-of-age process. But most importantly, reggaeton's irreverence is used in the novel to criticize the status quo and mock those who accuse this type of music of corrupting the country. Before moving forward, it is worth explaining briefly what the term Palomos means. In the Dominican context, Palomo has several meanings. The most common one is a young man that has a difficult character. Yet another definition is that of a good person, weak in character, and very naive. Both definitions apply to several of the young characters in the novel. As teenagers, they are inexperienced and naive, but they can also be difficult and rebellious. That being said, if one studies the trajectory of the Bildungsroman or coming-of-age novel, it is curious that Valdez would use reggaeton to write this type of narrative. In its original iteration, this type of novel focuses on a young protagonist and how, and I quote, he enters life in a blissful days, searches for kindred souls, encounters friendship and love, but then comes into conflict with the hard realities of the world, and thus matures in the course of manifold life experiences, finds himself and becomes certain of his task in the world, end quote. For the most part, this means that the young protagonist will be upset or uncomfortable with his family's or his society's values, but will eventually come to terms with them and become, or be about to become, a successful citizen that embraces the status quo. For years, this explanation only referred to novels in which the young protagonist was male, white, heterosexual, and wealthy, or at least middle class. We do not have the time right now to get into how the genre has changed and has been used in cultural contexts different from 18th century Europe. But in recent adaptations of this literary genre, particularly in the Global South, the young protagonists are diverse in terms of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc., and may willingly refuse to embrace the status quo. In this sense, Valdez's use of reggaeton music in a literary genre that traditionally points to social integration and upholding the establishment is very telling. On the one hand, reggaeton has created a moral panic in some contexts where it is thought that it perverts young people. This fear stems from the idea that, and I quote, young people, much more so than adults, are thought to model their behavior after the lyrics they listen to. Adolescent youth are perceived as having left behind the innocence of childhood, but not having yet acquired the responsibility and mature sensibility of adulthood, end quote. And yet, Valdez mixes a literary form that in its classical sense pointed to social integration with music that has been considered immoral. The title of its chapter in the novel stems from the lyrics of a reggaeton song. There are a couple of exceptions. Here are some examples. Estamos fumando vida o estamos fumando muerte by Daddy Yankee. That would be the introductory part of the novel. Tu ética no es mi ética by Tego Calderón, chapter 5. Tú sabes que tienes veneno entre las piernas, calle 13, chapter 7. Mil lágrimas derrama un corazón de metal, Ivy Queen, chapter 11. Amaneció bajo las alas de la muerte, chapter 16. That would be Don Omar. And all the other chapters I like that. I'm just sharing a couple of examples here. Throughout the plot, the narrator tells us what he and or his friends have been listening or singing to. Although there are a couple of hip-hop songs, a few rock songs, and reference to Latin pop singer Paulina Rubio, most of the music is reggaeton. The last pages of the book include a list of all the songs mentioned in the plot with information on the album they were in and the singer that popularized them. A note encourages readers to complement their literary experience by listening to the songs mentioned throughout the book. In this sense, the readers have the option of having an oral experience that connects him or her to the novel's protagonist. Antonio is the novel's main character. He has moved recently to a new neighborhood or barrio where he meets Lacacho, a slightly older teenager that is the community's bully. The other male teenagers hang around Lacacho and do all they can to gain his acceptance. For this reason, Antonio lies about his love for literature, creative writing, and hobbies that some might consider nerdy. He has seen how they treat Americo, a weak and studious teenager, and wants to avoid that type of harassment. The group of boys gets together to play video games, watch fancy cars drive by, try to hook up with girls at a place called the Doll's House, get money for tattoos, and listen to reggaeton. As a matter of fact, they have talked about starting a reggaeton group, and given Antonio's talents with language, he is tasked with writing reggaeton songs for the group's first album. This is something that I will not have the time to get into in today's talk, but I can gladly answer some questions afterwards. I am focusing on the theme of national identity and nationalism and all that, but it is very interesting to also address the novel from an aspect that focuses on gender and gender dynamics, particularly given how some reggaeton lyrics can be perceived as offensive towards women or they're highly sexualized, and the role that female characters have in this novel. The mention of Paulina Rubio is very interesting because she is a Latin pop star from Mexico. She has a couple of musics that talk about women's empowerment and freedom and being independent. And it is very interesting that when the young protagonist is trying to hook up with girls, there's this older woman who just like gives him information about Paulina Rubio. And it kind of like makes you wonder if this is like saying, yes, there's reggaeton and there's this perspective of women, but there are other perspectives that as a young teenager coming of age, you also need to be aware of. Antonio's father is very worried about him and blames reggaeton for his son's problematic behavior and unprofessional clothing. On the contrary, Antonio's mother has a very different approach and reminds her husband how they used to get in trouble as teenagers for listening to certain type of music. She also mentions something that is repeated throughout the novel and challenges the idea that reggaeton in and of itself corrupts people. And I quote from the novel, "If people acted accordingly to the music they heard, all politicians and police officers would be outstanding citizens because they only listen to the national anthem," end quote. The nation and how it needs to be defended by all citizens is one of the common themes that is ridiculed throughout the novel. It is also this aspect that will get Antonio in trouble at school. On a very hot day, the students at the school are taken to the playground to prepare for a patriotic march. Some students are unwell because of the high temperatures and humidity. The teacher in charge calls the school's director so that she may instill order. Throughout the whole time, Antonio has stayed standing firmly in his place. He is also able to control his laughter when other students tell jokes. The director notices him and commends him publicly for being an example of what a true patriot really is and for his unwavering commitment towards the nation, even on a very hot day. She indirectly compares him with founding father of the Dominican country, Juan Pablo Duarte, and actually cracks a racist joke while doing so. From that day, the students make fun of Antonio by calling him El Prócer, which translated loosely would be like the national hero or the national dignitary. And there's a picture of Juan Pablo Duarte. Another student that is mentioned throughout the novel as the congressman's son reaches out to Antonio with an idea to get back at the school director. And it is worth mentioning that this character's name is never mentioned. It's always being referred to as he is the congressman's son. This teenager is described as conceited and privileged. He is fully aware of the fact that he can get away with pretty much anything. Deep down, he's a coward since he sets up others to do all sorts of pranks and violent acts, but never takes responsibility for those actions. Antonio hears his idea and decides to get back at the director. Unbeknown to the school officials, Antonio has managed to take the CD with the national anthem and put in its place a CD with the reggaeton song Mente Sana by the Guanábanas. Sure enough, everyone is standing and ready to hear the national anthem when all of a sudden they hear Pa'l carajo la mente sana, yo lo que quiero es marihuana. Loosely translated as, screw a healthy mind, I just want to smoke weed, or I just want to smoke marijuana. The students start laughing, the teachers are speechless, and the director is furious. After threatening everyone with serious punishment unless the prankster comes clean, Antonio confesses and spares everyone else from the punishment. He is still called El Prócer, or the national hero, but now students say so with awe and reverence, and not to make fun of him. His true heroism is not defending the national anthem or participating in a patriotic march, but in questioning the nationalistic discourse and taking responsibility for his actions. This is the opposite of what politicians do. As you may recall our earlier quote, they may listen to the anthem, but they're actually corrupt and are unwilling to take responsibility for their actions. In this sense, naughty Antonio is more mature than some of the people in the Dominican Congress. Antonio's dad is very upset, and I quote, reacted as if with the reggaeton remix at the school, the country had fallen apart. He spoke about the country as if it were a piece of his heart. He accused me of high treason and betraying civic values. Not even when they accused the president of the republic of all kinds of abuses did he become as angry as this. This is a quote from the novel, and it's Antonio talking about how angry his father is. The school director decided not to expel Antonio with the condition that he visits a psychologist, who happens to be her daughter. Antonio is fully aware of how unethical this is, since his parents now have to pay a lot of money for each visit. At this point, there is something very interesting that happens with the music. The psychologist asks him about his musical preferences. Antonio talks to her about rap and reggaeton. She encourages him to listen to instrumental music instead because, in her opinion, reggaeton es basura, is garbage. Antonio often replies to her questions with lyrics from songs by Marilyn Manson that, for different reasons, the psychologist does not understand. So it is very funny because here's this lady telling you need to be cultured, reggaeton is trash, and you need to listen to something different. And he just replies with these quotes in English that are from Marilyn Manson, the rock star. And she has no idea what he's saying. She has no idea who Marilyn Manson is, and she doesn't realize that he's actually insulting her. Once again, we see a contrast between someone that listens to supposedly good music, the instrumental music that the psychologist proposes, but has no qualms about charging an exorbitant amount of money for ridiculous psychological therapies vis-a-vis the one who listens to bad music, Antonio, and would not be comfortable participating in something similar for personal gain. And by this, I'm not making fun of psychology or psychiatry or mental health resources. It's just that the psychologist that he's visiting is very unethical. Sometimes when they are in a psychological session, she just, opens her purse, takes out her makeup, starts like putting makeup on her face, and just doing very weird stuff that is very unprofessional. This aspect of Antonio's questioning even what a professional is doing is also highlighted when he is hanging out with his friends and they listen to a talk show in which they claim that reggaeton is corrupting the young people and leading the country astray. Antonio calls the program's hotline, and his call is on the air. He says, and I quote, "I want you to tell me if the military sergeant they caught with a truck full of cocaine listened to reggaeton, and if the former president they put in jail for being corrupt grew up listening to Tego Calderón," end quote. So he's trying to make the case like, well, I mean, those famous people, important people that were arrested for corruption, they didn't listen to reggaeton and look at all the bad stuff they did. So he's challenging them, saying, you're assuming that by people listening to Ed's type of music, that automatically makes them a bad person, or that is just going to corrupt them. As it is expected, the people in the talk show do not answer his questions. Their critiques and moral panic point to what reggaeton scholar Raquel Rivera has stated regarding how, and I quote, "Censoring a music genre is, of course, a much more manageable task than reducing unemployment, improving the quality of public education, providing health care, or lowering the murder rate," end quote. It is not surprising that one of the songs mentioned in the novel is Héctor Antito's Después que cae la lluvia, a song that questions politicians. And this is a verse from the song. "Legisladores, ¿dónde está el ejemplo si están robando hasta en su mismo templo?" Which translation would be, legislator, what is the example if you're stealing even from your own temple? Antonio is somewhat vindicated when the school director invites a famous historian to talk to the students about the importance of knowing their country's history. Antonio asked during the Q&A if he thinks that reggaeton can be a useful tool to encourage the study of history by writing reggaeton lyrics about important events. To everyone's surprise, the historian tells Antonio that that is an excellent idea and encourages students to do that. As you can probably imagine in the novel, the school director is not pleased by that answer. By now, Antonio has become famous at school and also with his neighborhood friends. He, on the other hand, is starting to learn more about Lacacho and is troubled by some things. First of all, he realizes that Lacacho is illiterate, and that is why he bullies kids that are studious. He also learns that Lacacho's brother is in jail. He doesn't really know who his father is, and his mother has been emotionally abusive towards him. In this case, many reggaeton songs about violence summarize Lacacho's personal experience. The irony is that Lacacho argues with his mother in public, and she blames reggaeton for her son's poor behavior. And I quote, "That music is what is harming these kids. I don't know where this youth will end up with the bad example of this music." But at that moment, a truck passes by, and El Mexicano's reggaeton song, Carlitos, Rest in Peace, is playing loudly, and the lyrics, "¿Quién le da a comer espinas a su hijo, esperando que se ahogue con el pan que se ha comido? ¿Quién le da hielos a su hijo para que masque, esperando la aguadita para darle jaque mate?" Translation would be, who gives his son thorns to eat, hoping that he will choke on the bread he has eaten? Who gives their son ice to chew, waiting for the water to kill him? This example points out to how young people are being destroyed by issues such as lack of parental guidance, not enough access to education, racism, and poverty. My reading of this part of the novel resembles what Carmen Oquendo and Liliana Ramos have stated about how, and I quote, "It is innocent to think of a neat casual relationship between music and violence without scientifically examining how much teen violence stems from music and how much from violent homes, divorce, parents' alcohol abuse, incest, neglect, and abandonment," end quote. Lacacho's experience is eye-opening for Antonio. On the other hand, Antonio can empathize with him. On the other hand, he is also becoming tired and frustrated with Lacacho's bullying and pranks, and is starting to see that his own parents are really looking out for him. This is reiterated when Lacacho helps Antonio escape late one night to go to a dance club. Although they're minors, Lacacho has managed to get them in. Antonio feels confused and out of place, but starts to get the hang of it when an usher walks up to him with his dad. His dad is visibly annoyed, but just tells Antonio to come outside so that they can talk. Antonio walks out, he's asked to get in the car and is driven home. He's grounded and obviously upset, but also has an honest conversation with his dad and thanks him for not making a fuss inside the dance club in front of everyone. He felt that his dad actually treated him like a man, like an adult. His dad, in return, promises to give him money and take him to a dance club when he's old enough. The question is, how did Antonio's dad know where to look for him that night? Remember, he has just escaped out of the house without anyone seeing him, and all of a sudden his dad shows up at the dance club. Well, Lacacho had invited Antonio to the dance club and had later called his parents to tell him that Antonio had snuck out and was in the club. That incident, along with Americo's suspicious death after a weird prank, makes Antonio realize that perhaps it is time to cut ties with Lacacho. Americo is the character that I mentioned earlier in the talk. He's kind of like nerdy, and he's very, he's very quiet and very shy, and Lacacho just bullies him. And there's a mysterious case in which Americo is in his house, he's climbing up a tree trying to gather some guava fruit, and all of a sudden he falls down and he dies. And it seems that Lacacho had something to do with it by perhaps throwing rocks or something to Americo while he was up in the tree and causing him to fall down and die. The turning point comes when the congressman's son invites Lacacho and Antonio to his house to talk business. He wants to pay Lacacho and Antonio to get some guns and shoot the school. Antonio realizes that this is not a joke and tells the congressman's son that if he wants to do things like that, he needs to grow up and do it himself, and not use his father's money and influence to get people to do his dirty business. However, Lacacho is sold and stays behind planning the shooting. The shooting never takes place, but Lacacho threatens to burn and or shoot the houses of the group members to avenge the bad things their parents have done to them. Everyone else is afraid to speak up or contradict him, but Antonio lashes out and contradicts him publicly. He realizes that Lacacho is also a coward who is trying to hide his insecurities and family problems with his macho facade and toxic masculinity. The novel ends with Antonio claiming that he's not willing to let someone like Lacacho or the congressman's son bully him or control what he wants to do. It also shows that listening to reggaeton music has not corrupted him or made him participate in violent acts. Rather, the so-called inappropriate lyrics point to the real structural issues that lead to this violence. Like reggaeton scholar Raquel Rivera has explained, and I quote, "The difference between art and reality is ignored when audiences are assumed to consume passively and mimic obediently. Reggaeton music has been accused of promoting and inciting certain types of behavior. However, it is difficult, if not impossible, to assess effect. Even though many claim that common sense is proof enough that there is a direct correlation between artistic representation and action, there is no conclusive evidence to support it." End quote. Thus, in this coming-of-age novel, the protagonist goes through a learning process that does not lead him to fully embrace the status quo, as it is shown in the way he criticizes corrupt politicians and questions the rhetoric of being loyal to the nation. Nonetheless, he does not agree with violent attacks to institutions like schools and families, like Lacacho and the congressman's son wants to do. Moreover, through his experience, the novel questions the idea that listening to certain types of music will lead to corruption, violence, and immorality, and rather allows readers to think about the structural issues that cause those structural problems to begin with. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if there are times for question afterwards? Yes? Any questions or comments? Oh, okay.
Figure out the timing for the question, but I do have just one question that came to my mind is, and first of all, thank you for such a fantastic talk. And I was thinking a lot about like Ellison and kind of American literature, but I was also thinking about how
lots of maybe Latin American youth in the US are thinking about their identity through reggaeton, and that these are, sorry, I can hear myself echoing, but that these artifacts are kind of circulating outside of the Caribbean to the US and have a kind of wider listenership. Do you know of, are coming of age novels circulating from the Caribbean to the US at all, either in Spanish or in translations, or are young people, Latin American youth in the US, also thinking about their identity through these kind of coming of age novels in addition to maybe the music that they're listening to?
So thank you for the question. Yes, there is a corpus of coming-of-age novels from the U.S. Latina point of view. And some of them are from the Caribbean. One of the ones that is pretty famous, and I know some people read it as a collection of short stories, but you can argue that it's a very fragmented coming-of-age novel, are the books by Junot Diaz, Drown, and This Is How You Lose Her. It really brings up what it means to have come from the Dominican Republic to the United States, and then trying to deal with contradictory discourses of race and masculinity. As to how much music is being incorporated in US Latina coming-of-age novels, I think that's an area that is worth exploring. There are mentions of music, but I personally haven't come across one that is specifically focused on some type of Cuban. Cuban or Puerto Rican or Hispanic Caribbean music. It is something also very interesting that you mentioned about the Caribbean and the United States, because reggaeton and in and of itself, it's very difficult to try to point where it actually came from and where it started, just because it has so many influences. You cannot talk about reggaeton without mentioning reggae from Jamaica and dancehall and dembow and hip hop. So it's like a combination of what was happening in Panama, what was happening in the Hispanic Caribbean, what was happening in the United States in areas like New York City, where you have African American communities and Afro-Caribbean communities all together and experimenting musically, that you have genres like reggaeton come kind of like back and forth, like from the Caribbean to the US, from the US to the Caribbean, and vice versa. It's quite a very interesting circuit there.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Well, we can thank our speaker. Thank you so much, Angela.
Thank you.
All right. James, we emailed you the next presentation. Is James here? He's here somewhere. Give it up one more time for Dr. Lorenzo. And we are very lucky that her home institution is this campus. So if you have further questions or want to take one of her classes, please take advantage, come and say hello. Where is James Jackson in the house? I didn't write a joke for this part. Can you send it to this email instead? We're just going to take a very short break while we load up the next presentation and be back with you in a few minutes. Please welcome Dr. O'Neill Jones.
Hello, can you hear me? Wonderful. So, I'm going to be talking to you today about the search for a post-colonial identity as expressed in the composition and arrangement of Jamaican choral music. So, as they said, my name is O'Neill Jones. I'm a DMA candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm also a visiting assistant professor of music education and choral music at the University of Wyoming. In preparing for my conducting recitals, I noticed that there was no music from the Jamaican choral repertory available to the rest of the world. And as a Caribbean native studying the choral arts as practiced in the wider world, my interests were piqued when I realized that the music of my people was not part of the conversation in any sphere. As I thought through the many pieces of Jamaican choral music I had experienced in my formative years, it became apparent that our own storied choral history was not documented nor explored in terms of its founding. Against this background, I set out to understand why the impetus must have been for composers who experienced Jamaica pre- and post-independent Jamaica to incorporate Afro-Caribbean and further Jamaican elements into their music. Did the thrust towards nationhood impact their compositional style as they too searched for their own history or artistry through the developing sense of Jamaicanness? So, as we might have known, Christopher Columbus arrived to the island of Jamaica in 1494, and he was met with music by the indigenous peoples of the island, the Taínos. In 1655, the Spanish colonization was ended with the conquest by Great Britain. By then, the Taínos had been all but extinct, and so they looked to West Africa for the enslaved. The introduction of the enslaved peoples from West Africa meant that black people outnumbered Europeans on the island. With their introduction, of course, came their many customs and influences which would add to the already diverse cultural context of the island. 355 years later, Jamaica was granted independence. We did not fight for it, we were granted independence. By that point, they thought they had no more to extract from the island and let it free. Though the identity quest had begun decades before, arguably with Marcus Garvey, one of our national heroes, and political leaders Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante, the granting of independence reinvigorated these efforts to gargantuan proportions. While there were many genres of music that became native to the country, none of them occupied a prominent place in the musical landscape. Music that was born of Jamaica's indigenous past or brought to the country from West Africa was thought unfit for public consumption beyond informal social gatherings. And so this, like much of the country's socio-cultural beginnings, was informed by its tumultuous colonial past that extends way into today. The racial subordination of the largest population on the island, the Black Africans, of course, and their Creole descendants was central to the colonial framework. Anti-colonial nationalism, which in turn became Jamaican nationalism, emerged from a wave of Creole nationalist thought that swept over the Caribbean following the British West Indian labor unrest of 1934 through 1939. That led to Jamaica's labor unrest or rebellion in 1938. The developing Creole identity of the 1940s posited that the people were neither European nor African, but a new group of brown Creole people who now sought to call themselves Jamaican. Here you will see Jamaica's national motto displayed on our coat of arms, which still holds two Taínos and on either side, with a crocodile mounted on the British crown and mantling. This is what we chose to use this was what was devised to characterize the racial demography of the nation, while also galvanizing the peoples towards the sense of national unity. According to Patton and Smith, it sought to homogenize the varied experiences of Jamaicans into one story of the island's journey toward self-determination. Jamaicans were now left to decide whether to accept both experiences as part of their new identity or to renounce the colonial past and start afresh. Here I would contend that the latter argument would seek to discredit and discount the hardships of the indigenous peoples and West African enslaved peoples who are critical to understanding whatever identity the nation was now seeking to create. Were we to remove the cassock of colonialism and move to the beats of our African heritage, or were we now to forge a new identity based on the many cultures now interwoven into the socio-cultural fabric of this developing nation? This is where the process of creolization takes root in Jamaica, and its people start the arduous journey towards a universally accepted idea of nationhood. So choral music in Jamaica has always occupied a significant place in the history of Jamaican people, starting well before the 1960s, of course, in around 1906. Scholars such as Ivy Baxter noted that choral music was the gateway through which classical music had its founding on the island, as it was often used by the British as a means of conversion. Though there were several choral groups in the early 1900s, including the Kingston Glee Singers and the Diocesan Festival Choir, which still operates today, their repertoire was strictly European. Both choirs were formed by George Good, who often remarked that the greatest musical need of Jamaica at the time was the cultivation of church music that reflected the experiences and religious affiliations of the people, a need that would not be realized for many, many years. Jamaica is what I would like to call hyper-religious. We have well over 1,600 churches on our just over 4,200 square miles, which means Jamaica would fit into the state of Arkansas over 12 times, and we have 1,600 churches, just for context. So it would stand to reason, of course, that the musical shift began with church music. Today, most choral groups in the country exist to explore music across time and cultures with a healthy injection of something Caribbean to appeal to the Jamaican audience's need to relate culturally to that which they're about to experience. In the Jamaican context, there has been very little emphasis on any fine art music, which has led to the promulgation of art music as being fully disconnected from Jamaica and the Caribbean, and existing only within a European framework. To fulfill the need for what one would call high art music, Jamaica looks to the Western European classical model, which resonates with very few Jamaicans, as it is thought to only resonate with, of course, the aristocracy, because only they can truly appreciate this type of music. Yet, even in post-independent Jamaica, very few composers sought to explore the creation of music that reflected this developing Jamaican nationalist ideal. Jamaican musicians were entangled in a never-ending spiral of performing the music of Europe from the choral canon, which is simply the most popular choral music from the Renaissance all the way through the 20th century, in a social and, of course, historical vacuum. According to Pamela O'Gorman, an Australian musicologist who settled in Jamaica in the 1960s, musicians were not keen to create the music that reflected their own experiences, as their own cultural self-confidence had been deliberately undermined for centuries under British rule. Now, her insight is particularly valuable as she was arguably the most published musicologist in Jamaica at the time, as she regularly published articles about Jamaican music for some 20 years. As such, her research gives the most complete view of the Jamaican musical landscape at pivotal points in Jamaican history. That is, when society started to forge a consciously post-colonial cultural language and aesthetic. Former Prime Minister of Jamaica, Edward Seaga, a sociologist who studied here in the United States at Harvard, in his own earnest to maintain a relationship with the African continent and the indigenous people of Jamaica, enlisted the help of Jamaican musicologist Dr. the Honorable Olive Lewin. He identified the struggles that ensued as part of the process Jamaica must undergo to identify and promote and, of course, retain those aspects of our culture that would further concretize for us a sense of Jamaican identity. As the minister responsible for culture and arts at the founding of the Jamaica Festival of the Arts in 1963, just 1 year after independence, he understood the importance, more than most, of the cultural assets to the nation as it moved forward. From this understanding, the Jamaican Festival of the Arts from 1963 was designed to fulfill two purposes. It was meant to unearth, promote, and encourage Jamaican talent all across the arts, that is, the performing arts, the culinary arts, the visual arts, creative writing, and of course, handcrafts. It also served to expose and preserve those orally transmitted cultural traditions that often went neglected by the masses. In her groundbreaking study, Dr. Lewin argued that even up to independence, much of Jamaica's music education curriculum was strictly British in scope and in nature. Music teachers were firmly rooted in the Royal School of Music, or Trinity College London framework, which focused on music only in performance. Despite this type of neglect, the music and folk forms have survived to present day because of grassroots participation by members of the lower classes, much to the dismay of those in the upper classes who sought to relegate this music to the rural areas of the island. Dr. Lewin herself was a classical pianist and violinist who studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London. And prior to those studies, she, like many Jamaicans, never saw the serious study of folk music as viable. At that point, she merged her classical European studies with her newfound zeal for ethnomusicology and took to arranging Jamaican folk music for performance. Thus, the Jamaican Folk Singers were born, a group that continues to this day to carry out its mandate of preserving Jamaica's folk music through performance. Following the granting of independence in 1962, many Jamaican folk music forms started growing in popularity. The music of Bob Marley that most people know put reggae on the map, and its predecessor, ska, were also gaining traction behind the scenes. Interestingly, even though those elements were gaining traction and things that were incorporated into the music that made them uniquely Jamaican, we must acknowledge that Jamaican folk form mento, which you will see there noted, is the underlying heartbeat of all Jamaican music. Be it reggae, ska, anything that comes after that was built on this music here. However, the music was not very much appreciated by the rest of the country. At that point, Jamaicans were left to contend with quite a number of ideas. Were we British? Were we African? Were we Creole? Or were we Jamaican? Having a mix of all of these things together. You will also see here the Jamaican language, written in the Jamaican language, which was codified in 1962. However, less than 3% of the country can actually write or read the Jamaican language. So, to this day, British English remains our national language. Choral music after 1962. Dr. Lewin continued her research, of course, in the earnest to create and maintain what we now call the Jamaica Memory Bank Project, which houses over 9,000 Jamaican folk melodies. She used those tunes to compose large-scale works and arrange existing works that would influence many others to compose and explore using Jamaican folk forms as the basis. She would go on to compose an entire folk mass that was commissioned by the Anglican Church in the Caribbean, though the work has never been published and is very rarely performed. Pardon me. Here we are. Her arrangements and compositions, however, remain unpublished and are only performed by the Jamaican folk singers. Now, while there are many other Jamaicans who were composing and arranging music at the time, namely Lloyd Hall, Mapletoft Poole, Kestner Robertson, Paulette Bellamy, Marjorie Wiley, and Clyde Hoyt, none were more prolific than Noel George Dexter. Dexter lived from 1938 to 2019, and so he experienced both pre- and post-independent Jamaica. This, I believe, bolstered his appreciation for Jamaican music and the Jamaican musical landscape of the past while looking to the future. Calling upon his various influences, he sought to utilize to the fullest those folk melodies and rhythms he often heard around him as a boy. As primarily a church musician, Dexter used these rhythms as the basis for many of his liturgical works, from his psalm settings to his ever-popular Christmas works that are sung all around the country and some across the world. For example, his Psalm 23 is published in 31 hymnals across the world. In the spirit of nationalism, he also composed patriotic works that were meant to inspire nationalist ideals on the heels of independence, on the heels of the Black Power movement here in the United States, which was also influenced by one of our national heroes, Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Pieces such as We Are Proud Jamaicans and the University Song for the only regional university in the Caribbean, the University of the West Indies, were composed by Noel Dexter. And he would often say that much of this was born out of his own nationalist ideal, looking towards a truly free and post-colonial Jamaica. He started composing in the 1970s with the psalm settings Psalm 27 and 24 as a direct response to being asked to have his students sing Mendelssohn's I Waited for the Lord at a conference at the Caribbean Council of Churches. Having realized there was nothing on the program with a Caribbean flair, according to him, he composed those pieces using the mento rhythms to distinguish them from the typical European works that would typically be on that program. Being positioned as the director of the University Singers in Jamaica, the premier choral group on the island and arguably the Caribbean by way of history and legacy, he was also always composing and encouraging young composers to write their own music. Pardon me again. Of course, there remained one caveat to his urging. The piece must be Jamaican. Before looking at any piece that you would put in front of him, his first question would be, what about it makes it Jamaican other than you? Typically, the University Singers would perform over 6 weeks. They would perform 25 weekend shows showcasing music from all across Jamaica and the rest of the world. But because of positioning within the Caribbean, we cannot order music today and have it delivered to us tomorrow. Dexter sought to write his own music. The show was focused on showcasing Caribbean music through folk and popular music such as calypso, reggae, and dance hall. And while the first half of the program often showcased European music in the choral recital style, Dexter would often invite his choristers to write music, as he thought this was always the only way that we would reclaim Jamaica as a musical space from the Europeans themselves. This he did for well over 30 years as the longest-serving musical director in the history of the group. This Jamaican choral style, as we now know it, is a combination of Jamaican folk rhythms and language with the addition of percussion to liturgical and other works that may also be composed in a classical European style. Of course, this is due to the fact that the country's heritage is such that there is a sort of hybridity that exists between Jamaican choral music and the music of Europe. Using Dexter and the University Singers as a model, many young composers from other groups have started to compose music in this new Jamaican style for their own groups. Franklin E. Halliburton, now musical director of the University Singers, Dr. Andrew Marshall, and Cedron Walters of the Jamaica Youth Choral were all influenced by Dexter, as is evidenced in their own outputs. Jamaican spirituals, folk songs, and anthems with elements of Jamaican music incorporated are significant portions of all of their oeuvres. Some of them have even used Dexter's works as the basis for their own arrangements. Now, Dexter, as a prominent Jamaican nationalist, thought that Jamaicans could only empower themselves through music by singing and creating their own music. In his final interview, he was quoted as saying, he typically grew tired of singing in the bleak midwinter in a country where he would never experience it. And so he sought to use intentionally Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean rhythms, the Jamaican language, and incorporate percussion instruments into the music for the concert stage and liturgical use. Those are the things that I believe make him the most interesting and influential proponent of the musical genre in the history of Jamaica. Thank you. Questions? No questions? It was that clear? Yes.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting information.
Thank you.
I'm just curious about your process of doing the research. Is it easy to find this in archives in Jamaica? What is the process like?
I love that question so much.
The archive is usually white and European, and then others seem to be lost or scattered all over the place. So I'm wondering about your research process.
Absolutely. So I worked with Noel Dexter about 10 years before he passed away, and so most of the information that I received from him, I received firsthand. Close to when he was about to pass away, the University of the West Indies commissioned a project to notate all of his pieces that he'd ever composed. So I currently have well over 90 pieces of his that we're working to publish. But the process has been speaking to the only person from that era who is still alive, Marjorie Wiley, who is also a part of the process of getting Jamaican music for the very first time, or the Jamaican language, on TV for the very first time in a children's show called Ring Ding in 1964, where for the first time ever in the history of the country, the Jamaican language was being spoken on TV, and it was not being thought of as someone or as people who were from the lower echelons of society. And so Marjorie Wiley, for example, as I said, is the only one that's still alive. And so I've been talking to her a lot about the people who were writing at the time, because of course, all of them would have been working in the same musical sphere. The music that is housed in the Jamaican Memory Bank project is simply the melodic lines of all of these folk tunes that Dr. Lewin would have composed, and all of her arrangements are only performed by the Jamaican folk singers. She has not released them to the public. She was about to release her mass at one point, however, she had a conflict with the Anglican Church, and she decided not to, and she has not published anything since. Mr. Dexter published 2 things in his lifetime that are housed in a book called Let the People Sing, that was done by the Caribbean Council of Churches in 1963, and he has not published anything since. And it's also interesting that you ask that question, because I am planning for the very first time at the end of this month at CU Boulder, we're hosting the very first Jamaican Choral Music Symposium, where we're inviting 600 high school students from all across Colorado to come to CU Boulder, and we've brought the university singers that Dexter worked with for a number of years to Boulder, and they learned some of these pieces with them. And the hardest part of that process was deciding whether or not there was music for us to actually send to people, because we would find one score, and that score would not line up with everything that the choir was typically used to singing. So there are 10 different versions of all of these pieces, because no one thought it was worthy of writing down our own music. Yes, you're welcome. Yes? I can hear you.
Thanks so much, and I'm sure many people are interested in hearing about the publication process, especially if there are future music educators and choral music educators in the room.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us about when these songs are going to be published and more about how you're going about that?
Absolutely. So a part of what we want to do as a part of the Jamaican Choral Music Symposium is, at the end of the symposium, should all go well, we are going to create a website for the publishing of Jamaican choral music, where instead of going to J.W. Pepper and buying the music there and trying to go home and learn it in isolation, we're going to create particular resources, for example. So if we're teaching you a song such as one of Mr. Dexter's Psalms, you'll be able to purchase the piece, and then you will also have recordings by the choirs for which they were written on the website for you to access them. So you don't have to go home and try to understand what that rhythm I showed you earlier, how to actually accent that. Because unlike typical European music where the accents fall on 1 and 3, in Jamaican music, particularly mento, the emphasis is on 4 and 1. So we have this folk song called Carry Me Aki. It goes, carry me Aki, go Alinstin ma nata, because the emphasis again is on 4 and 1. So we want to make sure that we have those resources available to people. So look forward for that by the end of the year, but the only thing that's holding us up is because Mr. Dexter just passed away, they're still trying to decide and work through all of his, final details. Any other questions? I was that clear? All righty, well, thank you all. Oh, yes, awesome.
Jamaican choral pieces that... What are some Jamaican choral pieces that you think should be taught today in schools? Just a few that you think are important.
All of them? So the most accessible one right now, I would think, is Mr. Dexter's setting of Psalm 150. It's called "O Praise Ye the Lord." Funny story about that. As a university student, he wanted to win money like all university students do. And so he wrote that Christmas piece because, again, he was tired of singing in the bleak midwinter. And so I'd say that one and his Psalm 23. All of those are available through Osberg Press. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes?
Was it well received, this music, when it
Absolutely not. It was not. It was not well received.
was it perceived as being irreverent?
In a sense, yes, particularly because they introduced African drumming to the high European-style churches. And the thing is, unlike the Catholic faith, the Church of England did not allow people to compose because, one, they never had the money, and two, they felt empowering people to think for themselves would mean that they would start thinking in another way. And so, unlike the Catholic faith, where people were being encouraged to actually compose and write music, which would be incorporating some of their own historical language and musical language, that is, the Church of England did not allow that. And so when when Dr. Lewin, for example, went into the church with Nyabingi rhythms, which are based in Rastafari, and Rastafari from Ethiopia, they wanted to throw her outside of the church. So that took quite a long time to actually get traction. And then eventually people started thinking, I can continue to do this. And I think that's like what I said. The reason it's so impactful is because people were being exposed to this on a national level because of the university singers. Every national event that's happened, they've been the ones to perform. So they've performed for every sovereign that we've had since their founding. They performed for Desmond Tutu when he visited, all of those people. They performed for, I can't remember his name right now, Nelson Mandela when he came, so all of those things. And because they were constantly providing Jamaican choral music to everyone across the world, then I think people were like, this is our music and it actually means something to us. Now we can lean into it. So, but it only started like in the past 20 or so years. Before that, it was not the case. Any final questions? Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Let's hear it one more time for our incredible presenters. So unfortunately, I'm afraid to share with you that Dr. Banton, who is an incredible distinguished professor on our campus, is not well today, so she will not be able to give her presentation. But we will let you know when that gets rescheduled, so please look out for that. And we hope you'll join us either this evening at 6 o'clock in the Epley Band Hall for the clinic on Latin music, or back here tomorrow at 11:50 for the incredible Elio Villafranca, who will be starting his whole day residency at the Faulkner Center. It's going to be really fantastic, so I hope you can join us. And the concert tomorrow is at 7:30 right here on this stage. It's really going to be a one-of-a-kind show, one of the greatest, most incredible pianists in the world, so I hope you can join us. And then don't forget, Saturday at noon, come for food, come for music, come for the hang. And thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon.